ultimate home server. All right. There's already an incredible thread on the Level 1 forum about building the ultimate repository of knowledge, the panopticon of all human knowledge. And sure enough, the first things that enter into the conversation is, what hardware? Do I need some sort of fire-breathing home server? No, a lot of the time you can use a Raspberry Pi. But I want to talk about Raspberry Pis because everybody is really excited about the Raspberry Pi. It's a $35, single board computer. It runs Linux. This is a building block that is used by a lot of people to start building something for your home server, and it is perfectly capable. There are versions of the Raspberry Pi that are just a compute module that you add to a printed circuit board, and it gives you other things. Home Assistant, which we cover on this channel a lot, has a version of their Home Assistant hardware that uses the compute module and gives you Home Assistant control. We have our whole Internet of Things series that sort of covers some of the things you can do with Home Assistant, and you keep adding stuff to Home Assistant, and you cherry pick and you build all this kind of stuff. So this Ultimate Home Server thing ends up kind of being a paint by numbers series where we go over different software packages and how you can use it. And so one of the first videos I want to get out of the way is some of the options for hardware and using something like a Raspberry Pi. Now, one way that the Raspberry Pi has disappointed me on the 5 and 10 year time scale, because the original Raspberry Pi is very old at this point, came out a long time ago, is the endurance of micro SD cards. And let's face it, backing up your micro SD card, backing up your Raspberry Pi, making it to where it's repeatable. You do this really awesome configuration, you get everything set up in your Raspberry Pi, and then you have to restore it. So I did a step-by-step walkthrough of doing network boot off of your Raspberry Pi. That means that you don't have any local storage on the Raspberry Pi. It will boot off of your network, and you can maintain file versions, you can change boot up parameters, you can do literally everything, but the compute happens here. And so this is really nice because it gives you some really awesome flexibility for your home server. Me personally, I use it for air quality monitoring and Home Assistant control of my HVAC. So you get a multi-zone HVAC, so I can turn different fan motors on and off in my HVAC. I don't really want super full control of the HVAC in terms of I do actually have thermostat control, kind of like Google Nest on steroids, except there's no cloud involved. It works when there's no internet, and the boiler part of my house even works when there's no electricity because it's a gas boiler. And the Iron Fireman, that was an Internet of Things series video. With the Raspberry Pi, I can plug in an autopilot data logging air quality sensor, which will log the temperature, the relative humidity, and a bunch of other things. I can have software on a Raspberry Pi deal with that. The problem is that I don't really want to do too much system administration after hours. That's not a really great promise. So the super nerds among us, that's okay. It's a little bit of a lie. I do actually like to do home administration, server administration. But what my point is that once we figure out a package for the Raspberry Pi, the super nerds, then we can package it up and give it to you and just say, click on this or deploy that. The ultimate end goal for the ultimate home server is to make it to where you don't have to manage individual Raspberry Pis. You can just enroll them and you're good to go. There's a company called Balena. You may have used the Balena etcher to burn micro SD cards for your Raspberry Pi. That Balena. I don't know if I'm even pronouncing that correctly. They actually have a whole home audio solution. And so I got my Serwin Vega bookshelf speakers here. Nothing to write home about, nothing remarkable. Got a $25 Foci audio. This is like $25 online. It's a nice little 50 watt, 2-channel audio adapter. You can go from the analog out on your Raspberry Pi into this and have a really nice bookshelf speaker setup if you already have something like that, or analog, any kind of analog for your home stereo. This is a PDP-11. This is a PDP-11 that runs PDP-11 emulation software, which is really Linux under the hood. And I can take analog audio out of my PDP-11 into the amplifier and use this as an audio system. But I'm not really using the PDP-11 to control the audio system. I can control it from my phone. I can control it from a whole bunch of other things. The magic is when you have 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 Raspberry Pis and you're doing whole home audio. If you look at commercial solutions, they range from, I think that the least expensive one I could find was almost $500 for just the modules. And the most expensive one was running into the multiple thousands of dollars. Well, with a setup like this, you're out like $100-ish for the speakers and $25 for this. and a $35 Raspberry Pi. You don't need a micro SD card. You don't need anything. You can configure this to boot off the network. You got to configure your network for that. And then you can run the software and everything else over NFS. And then you can use your Raspberry Pi for home automation. You can use your Raspberry Pi for distributed audio. You can use your Raspberry Pi for really pretty much anything. Now, we still need to do management and control of the software, but auditing and some other things is a little easier. And you're also not depending on that micro SD card. It's really easy to take a snapshot, make changes, roll back the changes, reboot the Raspberry Pi. This one also has what's called a Power over Ethernet hat, which I covered in the Internet of Series things. And the Power over Ethernet hat means that I plug in an Ethernet cable. That's the only connection this thing needs. It's got power. It's ready to run. I don't actually like the PoE hat, Raspberry Pi 2018 version. Like this version of the hat, I don't like it because if you have a USB peripheral or anything that uses even a slight bit of power, it's not enough power for the PoE hat to really keep up with, it seems. So this PoE hat has not been really stable with the Raspberry Pi 4B unless I underclock the Raspberry Pi 4B. So that is an option. Now, I'm not showing you how to do that in this video. You have to check the other video on the Level 1 Linux channel. I'm just saying that if you're worried about maintaining a bunch of different Raspberry Pis and keeping the software in sync and having a million different SD cards, you don't have to juggle any of that. What I am saying is that you can use tools to manage the configuration on the Raspberry Pi, even up to and including the point where you boot a Raspberry Pi off the network. Me personally, I think that's a lot more sustainable because we can eventually, for this Ultimate Home Server Guide, if it makes sense, we could walk you through setting up diskless Raspberry Pis for your television, for your home stereo, for your PDP-11, whatever you want in your house. And you could, through a GUI, select what image that Raspberry Pi boots, or software configuration, or manage the updates. And Balena Whole Home Audio Solution is exactly that. They have a cloud control panel for that. The only problem with it is that it's not open source. So if you're running a whole audio, a whole house audio solution for just handling the media, check that out. If you're using something really high-end and commercial, all the way up to and including something like Roon, R-O-O-N, you should definitely check that out because I'd put that ahead of other whole home audio solutions from a technical and implementation standpoint, but you audiophiles out there will have to tell me about features. And you can use this kind of a setup with something like that. These are not things that you need to pay for on the subscription. Once this is figured out, it's done, and it's done pretty much forever. Aside from bit rot, you don't really have any maintenance to worry about. And so for consumers, I think it's kind of a ripoff that companies are really eager to set you up for subscriptions for these things. You got a Nest thermostat? The Iron Fireman thermostat in my house is pushing 100 years old. And if it wasn't for the brass wearing out in that, it would still be a perfectly usable and viable thermostat. Do you really think the Nest thermostat is going to be usable for 100 years? No. Is 100 years a reasonable goal for a thermostat? Well, no, not necessarily, but 20 years. That's really a separation. The Internet of Things philosophy is like, let's separate the control plane from the software plane. We can change and upgrade the software plane all we want. Next year's Raspberry Pi, unplug this one, plug in the other one. I don't even have to swap the SD card. I change some magic numbers in a text file, and boom, I'm off to the races with the new Raspberry Pi. All of the hardware that I'm putting in place to control the thermostat and door sensors and stuff like that on the Internet of Things side of things is pretty much going to be there from now until the end of time. The alarm panel that I used in the Internet of Things video, those have a lifetime of 10, 20 years, and we are well into the lifetime of co-opting alarm panel sensors for some kinds of this, and that works great for Internet of Things stuff because it's not really on the internet, and where it does connect to the internet is physically isolated from the actual, the rest of the sensors, so there's not really a lot of risk there. Where I'm taking a Raspberry Pi and I'm plugging it into the stereo system, the Raspberry Pi is a very competent place for attackers to live on your network forever. But if the file system comes from another device, it's much more auditable than it is on the micro SD card. And those problems haven't been solved yet, but the architecture of this is something that has been solved. And I wanted this video to kind of explain that, yeah, it is something that I'm considering. It is something that you should keep in mind. And eventually, when the nerds figure it out, when the nerds do the pathfinding, the average consumer can enjoy it without much more complication than just plugging some stuff into your network and downloading a software package and hitting go. Gosh, I do love the Raspberry Pi. This is a Pi Boy DMG. It's a Raspberry Pi, but it's a handheld video game console where you can play lots and lots of free and open source software. And older stuff like Doom, which is shareware, and you can also pay for Quake, stuff like that, runs on here pretty well. And other stuff, I mean, you can emulate older stuff, the Atari 2600 games if you've got the cartridges. So yeah, I don't know. Check out that video on the Level 1 Linux channel. I think the Raspberry Pi can have a place in the Ultimate Home Server Network, but I really, really like using the Raspberry Pi disklessly just for the management aspect. Disklessly is only half of that story though. The configuration management is the other half, and we'll figure that out. Oh, and by the way, if you master the skills for these kinds of things, like if you're, it's like, oh, I don't mind the home server automation thing. If you master the skills for the software packages that are involved with this, you can land a really nice job, because all of these tools, this level of automation, this plays real big in with the cloud providers and cloud automation and infrastructure as code. Really what we're doing here is the home version of infrastructure as code. We want to be able to cherry pick all the best pieces of software, put it together, and be assured that our data is reasonably transportable between different software solutions. And what I've talked about here gives you that in a way that maybe a Raspberry Pi with a micro SD card doesn't necessarily. And again, this is part of our Ultimate Home Server series. This is kind of the second video, and we're just talking about hardware, so we're a little off track because I want to talk about software mainly, but every video is going to be, what about a Raspberry Pi? What can I do with a Raspberry Pi? And you can do a lot. You can learn a lot. There's a lot that the Raspberry Pi is really cool. I concede the point. But yeah, we got to talk about software. I'm Wendell, this is Level 1. I'm signing out, and you can find me in the Level 1 forums.